India is the only country in the world which actually has an ocean named after it, the Indian Ocean. And if you all you need to do is look at a map, and you can see that we have a very long coastline. So it shouldn't be so surprising that much of our history is linked to the sea. Now, the problem is that much of Indian history, particularly pre-colonial Indian history, is written in such a way that it sounds almost landlocked. But the fact is that you cannot actually understand Indian history without understanding that India has a very long and very rich maritime history, and even the interiors of India cannot be understood without understanding our links to the rest of the world. There are many aspects of Indian culture, history, civilization that are very closely linked to this business of being linked to the sea. So now let me tell you a little bit about the sense of this. So the earliest clear maritime linkages that we can see from India to the rest of the world come from the very beginning, which is from the Harappan civilization. Back in the Bronze Age, we all know about the cities of the Sindhu and the Saraswati civilization built along the Harappan cities that were built along these two rivers and their tributaries. And of course, now there's increasing archaeology that suggests that there were fairly early Bronze Age cities also in the Gangetic Plain, and more evidence is suggesting, and ASI is finding many of them. One of them is very close to here in Sanoli, near Bagpat, where we have found remains of two chariots as well. But nonetheless, again, this is all the interiors of the country. So to look at the maritime aspect of this, you need to go to Gujarat. That's where, was a hub of, early maritime contact of India with the rest of the world. And to understand this, you first need to understand that the landscape back 4,000, 5,000 years ago in Gujarat was very different from what you see today. The sea levels were higher than they are right now, and that entire area was a lot wetter. So, because the sea levels were higher, the peninsula of that you see of Saurashtra today, which is a very prominent geographical feature of our west coast, that was actually an island. And the Kutch area, the Kutch itself was an island, and all the salt flats that you see today were actually the estuary of these two big rivers, the Indus and the Saraswati. The Saraswati was a flowing river. By this point, it was a very large rain-fed river, but it was still a very large river. And if you want to understand what a large rain-fed river can be, just go today to just near Chandigarh, and you'll be able to see the Ghaggar in spate right now as we speak. It's a raging spate, making its way through Haryana out through northern Rajasthan into Pakistan and back out, although by that point it dries out completely today. But in those days, it would flow all the way out into the Rann of Kutch. You also had the Indus, which actually till the 19th century used to flow much further east than it does today. So both of these huge volumes of water flowing into the estuary. And in this estuary, there were a large number of ports. Now, everybody knows about Lothal, but actually the biggest port in this entire area was the port of Dholavira. If you ever visit the site of Dholavira, so it's on this island, Khadir Island, which is marooned today in the middle of salt flats. Now, why on earth would anybody want to go there and build a large settlement? Because it didn't look like anything like it does today. It was an estuary. The river. It was brackish salt water, not different from the Sundarbans of today. And from there were these voyages going both eastward and southward. Now, when you talk about the ports of ports of Gujarat, today you will very often be told about Lothal and the dry docks and so on. But if you visit Lothal, one of the things that will strike you, there's this very large dry docks, but a very small settlement. The settlement in Lothal is actually surprisingly small for dry docks. Why? Because in fact, that wasn't a port at all. And my theory at least is that it was actually a customs checking point for those sailing up the Konkan coast and trying to get to Dholavira and all the other ports in and around the estuary area. And they were just stopped there and they were checked and then they were allowed to carry on. So that is what Lothal really was. And similarly, there was a western checkpoint in Bet Dwarka. So those who were sailing westward towards the Gulf would be stopped there and they would be checked and then they would be allowed to go in. I'm presuming that then once they were checked, a nice seal was put on their checked goods and they were allowed to go in and out as may be the case. And then, of course, the Indians were sailing out to Oman, to Bahrain, all the way through to Mesopotamia. And there is plenty of evidence of Indians in that area. There are all kinds of Indian products, including seals that you find there. There are records of a people called the Meluhans who were coming there to trade in things which are clearly Indian, things like ivory, peacocks, and so on. And there are also records of what they were doing. In fact, there is a very well-known case of a Meluhan being sued by a local for having broken his tooth in a drunken brawl. And he loses the case and he is then fined a few silver coins. For having got drunk and beaten this local Sumerian up. And my theory is that this is the origin of prohibition in Gujarat. Anyway, now this world that I described is very interesting because we know, for example, that what were the things we were exporting out, because we had beads, presumably textiles. We do find cotton threads, probably of Indian origin, because India was where cotton had been domesticated, and so on in other places. So we know what was being exported. We have literally no idea what was being imported. And there's a lot of controversy about that. I'll tell you my theory. My theory is that we were importing horses. Because there is evidence of horses in India, indigenous horses as well, but they were very small. And one of the problems of these indigenous horses, in fact, if you look at the chariot from Sanoli, it is very clear that whatever horses were being attached to it were no higher than this. Which is why they didn't use them sitting on top of them. They were using to pull a chariot because you couldn't actually sit on them. They were too small. And so larger Arabian horses were imported, and these were prize horses. And you are finding some horse remains in the Gujarat area as well. Sarhota and so. Yeah. Dholavira also you found? Oh, that's new. Has that been published? And so they have found horse remains. So there you go, Dholavira. And this also fits, by the way, with Vedic texts, where, interestingly, the horses are related, of course, with Ashwin twins, who are themselves named Ashwins. So they are related to horses. And they are, in the Vedic texts, associated with the sea. So the horses were associated with the sea, which makes perfect sense if you were importing them from Arabia. And we know that the Arabs had horses in a very early stage. There are 10,000-year-old drawings in the middle of the Arabian desert of horses. So horses were there in Arabia, even in the Neolithic period. Anyway, this world that I just described just came to a grand end around about 1900 to 2000 BC. Climate changed. The river Saraswati dried up. The Balochistan, which was grassland, completely dries up. Even the Gujarat area dries up. Sea levels, meanwhile, drop. So therefore, not only the rivers dry up, but the sea level falls and you get the salt flats of the Rann of Kutch. So this entire universe changes. In fact, even the flora and fauna changes. So in the Harappan texts, for example, in the Harappan seals, for example, you see lots of tigers, but you don't see any lions. Why? There weren't any lions in Gujarat. It was a wet landscape. And as it changes, the lions from the Middle East and Balochistan area begin to drift in and take over Western India, and the tigers retreat back further eastward. So this is the world that we now have, world that has suddenly climatic changes, the cities decline, and so on. But maritime activity now shifts to the east coast. And then you see voyages being conducted from the area which is from the westernmost outlet of the Ganga, which is now West Bengal, the Hooghly branch of the Ganga, a distributary of the Ganga, to the Lake Chilika. So that's, the Odisha, Bengal area. and lots of voyages in the Iron Age that are beginning to happen from that area. You have settlements, for example, like Chandraketugarh in just north of Kolkata. And you begin to see these voyages, and remember that at this stage, the sailors still don't know how to quite navigate using the monsoon. So they are kind of hugging the coast, just like the Harappans were basically hugging the Makran coast. These people are also hugging the coast. Some of them go southward, and then they begin to turn up in Sri Lanka. And so you have this legend, the founding myth of the Sinhalese people in Sri Lanka is that people from the Odisha, Bengal area, from Vanga, which is the old name of Bengal, came led by a somewhat rebellious prince called Vijaya, and they began to settle in Sri Lanka. And similarly, you have voyages going the other way as well, hugging the coast past the coastline of Myanmar, and then reaching the Isthmus of Kra, from which Malaysia hangs off, and then crossing to the other side, and then sailing off towards the Mekong Delta, which is Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on, and then ultimately even going up the coast towards Japan, China, and Korea. And not many people know this, but Korean history actually starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya, of all places. And the symbol of their royal family is two fish, which is exactly the same symbol as that of the kingdom of Ayodhya. Yeah. So anyway, so this universe carries on, and there's a beautiful story about how this came about. That there was a Brahmin merchant, captain of a ship called Kaundinya, who was sailing along the Mekong Delta when his ship gets attacked by pirates, and he fights them off, but then his ship gets leaks, and so he has to sort of his ship has to be beached, and he is fixing them when he gets surrounded by a local Naga tribe, and it looks very hopeless, but nonetheless, Kaundinya and his crew decide that they're going to fight and defend themselves. But the whole situation is rather bad because they are completely surrounded and completely outnumbered. But then their luck turns because the warrior princess who was commanding the Naga tribe sees Kaundinya and falls in love and proposes marriage by sending, by the way, a pan leaf and a supadi. This is an important point because supadi and pan are actually Southeast Asian plants. They are not Indian plants. That's how they came to India through trade. Anyway, Kaundinya, I suppose, has no choice in the matter. So he marries her, and together they set up a dynasty, and an empire called the Empire of Funan. And from that point to all the way to modern times, all the dynasties of Southeast Asia tend to trace their lineage back to that marriage. So this is a very important part. So there is a lot of impact of this. And all this trade keeps going on, both eastward and westward. And at some point around about the 1st century AD, there is a greater understanding of the monsoon wind. So what happens as a result of this is that voyages become much more systematized. You don't have to go along the coastline and spend so much time. You can just cross. And so then the kind of trade happens completely changes. So you have, for example, from the Kerala coast, you can go directly to Socotra and then up the Red Sea and trade with the Romans and Greeks and the Mediterranean world in general. And on the east side, you can directly cross the Bay of Bengal and go across to Indonesia, Bali, and Malaysia, and so on. And so you see this explosion of maritime trade, which goes on for the next 1,000 years odd. And of course, there is the well-known story of how empires like the Cholas, had the naval capability of even enforcing their writ in Southeast Asia militarily if they wanted to do. But it's important to remember through all of this that what we are dealing with is not, individual merchants on single ships going out and heroically trading. That may have been true in the beginning, in the Kaundinya period, which is, 3rd, 4th, 5th century BC, wherever you think the dating is. But certainly by the 10th century AD or 11th century AD, you are dealing actually with large fleets owned by merchant guilds. These merchant guilds are not small scale operations. They have names like the 500. So obviously 500 shareholders of this merchant guild, and they were basically multinational corporations. They had their own ships, they had their own navies and armies, and many of them were feared by the kings of their time. So and they would survive many dynasties. Or dynasties would come and go, but these corporations would work through the Pallavas, to the Cholas, and so on. So they had a life of their own. And interestingly, all these great voyages were being funded by financiers. Guess who they were? They were the temple banks. So that's why there was such a lot of gold in the temples. Why? Because these banks were basically the banks and the private equity. They were basically providing equity, and you have these copper plate contracts. Even today, in some of these South Indian temples that have survived, which talk about the contracts between the merchant guilds and the temple banks. In fact, you also have tripartite contracts between the merchant guilds who would do the trading, the artisan guilds who produces the cloth, and the financing private equity guys, which are the bank, the temples. And so all of this gold was there, and this was it was a serious machine. It was not like, as I said, don't think of this as like two guys in a boat going out. And a lot of our folklore is related to this. So both in Goa, but even more well known in Odisha, even today, on Kartik Purnima, you have this festival where the women and children go out to these water bodies and put small paper boats out with a lamp on it. So what are they doing? They are actually remembering these great voyages that set out. And why in Kartik Purnima? Well, all you have to do is to go to a coastal area on Kartik Purnima, and I've done it myself. Near Konarak, there's a beach called Chandrabhaga, and I witnessed it myself. What happens? The wind begins to blow from the north at about this time. This Kartik Purnima is in middle of November. By this point, the winds change, and they begin to blow from the north. So because you can blow from the north, you can now sail southward along with the wind, and then you can. So what they would do is they would take this wind, sail towards Sri Lanka using the wind, and then from Sri Lanka sail southward and use the equatorial currents to go across to Sumatra, and from there they would go out towards Bali. In fact, there's a festival that is done at the same time in Odisha called Bali Yatra, which literally means the voyage to Bali. Yeah, it's a 1 week festival. So now let me tell you something interesting that we are going to do, because I know you're getting fidgety about the amount of time I've been speaking, is that we're going to recreate this. And in order to recreate this, what we are going to do is that I have been designing this along with the Culture Ministry and the Navy, a ship built in the original style of the ships that used to sail 2,000 years ago. So remember what these ships were like. These ships were not nailed together. Why they were not nailed together, who knows? Because India, ironically, was one of the few countries in the world which actually had the technology for rust-free nails. So, you go to Mehrauli, you have a column with rust-free. So we were the only country in the world who knew how to make rust-free nails. And yet, we did not use them for some reason to build ships. Instead, the ships were built with a peculiar technology called stitching. So they would take the planks and they would stitch them together. Now, there's a long debate about why Indians preferred this particular design, because this is not the obvious way to build a ship. And in any case, they were in contact with other civilizations which were using other kinds of ships. So they were in contact with the Greeks and Romans, who used nailed frame ships, and the Chinese, who also used a frame and nailed it all together. But the Indians, reasons not quite understood, there are lots of theories, but not quite understood, we continued to build these ships by stitching them together. And they were not small ships. I'm talking about really large ships that were built. So what we are going to do, we are going to try and build ships using this technique. Now, this technique has almost died out. So for many generations now, no large shipping vessel has been made using these techniques. Small fishing boats in village, small boats the size of from here to that table maybe, are still built by the locals. But large ships like this have not been built for many generations, and we certainly haven't sailed them for these big voyages. So we are going to attempt to do this. If you want to get a sense of what this ship may look like, there is, just Google up on your phone, the Ajanta ship painting. Yeah, there's a painting in Ajanta of one of these ships. So we are going to use that. And of course, there are textual references. There are other sculptures, etc., of these stitch ships. We're going to use that to recreate this. In a few weeks' time, we'll lay the keel and we'll start construction of this ship. And then the idea is that in the next 18 months, we will get this ship together, build it together. It's not a small, it's not a very large ship, but it'll be about 21 meters long. So it's about, the Navy is supervising the building. There is a building team that is building it, about 60 feet long ship. And then the idea is to sail it from Odisha to Bali. Yes, sail it. And there'll be nothing modern on the ship except for some safety equipment and a few. Yes, we'll sail it from somewhere near Konarak and sail it on Kartik Purnima, hopefully Kartik Purnima of 2025. We are already starting to build the ship, and it will be a great adventure. And we will try and do it. 18 months to build, another 6 months to test it. Because remember, we have actually no idea how these ships handle. A stitch ship will have a flexible hull. So its handling qualities will be quite different from a modern ship, a metal or fiberglass ship. So we don't know how these things behave in a storm, for example. Normally it may be fine, but when you actually have a raging storm, what happens when you have a flexible hull? I don't know. No. So we have some ideas and so on. So there are some traditions that have survived. We have some texts. Yes. So for example, the Omanis tried to do it. They failed once, and then they later succeeded. So this is a risky thing, but somebody has to take the risk. We are going to do it. Then there are the issue of using square sails. Do you remember that in modern ships we use lantern sails? These are these triangular sails. They have certain characteristics and advantages. And interestingly, lantern sails were actually invented by the Indians in the Indian Ocean. But because we are building a ship from prior to that period, so although we invented it, we are going to be true to the period of the ship that we are building, which they use square sails. Now, square sails are good when the wind is exactly in alignment with the direction you want to go. But when you have to sail at a slight angle to it, and the wind may not always blow in exactly the direction you want to blow, then using a square sail to do angular, sail at an angle is a tricky business. And that combined with a flexible hull, who knows? So this is a tricky thing that we are trying. So let's be clear that there are risks to doing it. But at some point in time, we had to try it out, and we're going to try it out. With that, let me stop.